Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a fresh new session on credit risk modeling. And we were discussing the Basishek's asymptotic single risk frontier model, the model which frames or which forms the very background of the Basel models. That model which helps us understand that why is it that we develop the models at an account level and then aggregate it at the portfolio level. So that is the reason why we have been exploring this particular model, right? And over here in the last class, so I'll just quickly revise what we had done in the last class, right? Uh, in the last class, what we were trying to develop or what we were trying to talk about was the following. We were trying to explore the very basics of this model. So what we had done was what we had developed over here as a part of our model was we had gone through the Vasicek model, right? So we had gone through the asset price path. From there, we had defined the asset equation. Now, once we have defined the asset equation, the next thing that we did over here was we tried identifying out the asset path. And once that asset path was identified, from that asset path, we derive the probability of default, right? And we said that the probability so that an account would default if the asset of the borrower had gone below you know, had gone below the debt obligation that the borrower has taken. Say, for example, I had taken a loan of $20,000 from a bank, and now my total assets are worth $15,000. So obviously, I am not in a position to pay back that $20,000, and hence I will be a default. So over here, what we tried understanding in the last class was, since the last class, what we tried understanding was what exactly is this probability of default? What are the factors which had been impacting the probability of default? And so for that, what we saw was that so the condition that we had derived, right? So if you go back to the derivation which we had done, you would get to see that. So I'll just quickly summarize the condition that we had, and we'll bring in the discussion along that line. So one thing which we had seen was that the probability of default, or to estimate the probability of default, right? So it was nothing but the probability that the Brownian motion WAT, or the value of the Wiener process variable, was less than some given value Ci, where Ci stood for Di minus log Ai minus mu A sigma squared A T whole divided by sigma. So over here, what I get to see, this is the probability, the probability of default. Now, from here, what we saw was that we had said that this was nothing but this is equal to phi Ci. So we had called this value as Ci, and this Ci, which I said, this phi Ci is a cumulative normal distribution. And we had explained that why is it that this cumulative distribution was required, right? So now suppose, so what is the cumulative distribution function? The cumulative distribution function is nothing but it is the cumulative probability. So it gives us, or it helps us identify that the probability of a variable x to take a value which is less than equal to some given value. So if probability of x is less than equal to 20, then that comes out, for that value is taken out from a cumulative distribution function. So we had explained the concept of cumulative distribution function yesterday. Now over here, what we are trying to do is the following. We are trying to understand that what is this phi Ci. So PDI is phi of Ci. Now what is this phi of Ci? So over here Ci is a value, right? So this means that the phi of Ci simply means that the probability that WAT takes a value which is less than equal to C or less than C. So for a value of Ci which is greater than some C bar, right, WAT, the probability would not be defaulted. So let us see what this particular thing is all about. So over here, what we have is a cumulative distribution function. So over here, what I have is a cumulative distribution function. So in a cumulative distribution function, what are the heads over here? So over here, what I have is x, and over here, what I have is fx, a cumulative function. So what is a cumulative function over here, or how would a cumulative function look like? Say for example, I have a function like this. I say that probability of x equal to x is 1/3 between 0 and 1, right? 1/3 between 1 and 2, and 1/3 between for values greater than 2. So this is a value which is where all the functional the probability is same. So now what I want to know is that what is the probability of getting a number x less than 2? That means what? The probability that x is less than equal to 1 plus the fact that probability is greater than 1 but less than 2. So this is what is the probability of x less than 2. So over here what we have, so that means what? So a cumulative distribution function would look something like this. Ultimately, it would end up at 1. So as you keep on adding the probability values, it will increase in between and then it would flatten out. Why? Because if you look into the probability distribution or the partition of a normal distribution, that is a symmetric distribution, you will see that it picks up towards the middlemost values. Therefore, this distribution will also pick up in the middlemost values and then flatten out as you reach towards the tails. So towards the tails, the CDF or the cumulative distribution function will be flat at each of the ends, at each of the tails, and it would peak up towards the middlemost values. Now I say that, let's take this case. I say that okay, uh, Ci is less than 20. So basically, probability to default is the probability that WAT or the random variable, the wind up process takes a value which is less than 20. Less than 20. So say this is 20 over here. Therefore, the probability of the borrower to default will be the area under this curve. Right? This will be the probability to default, the area under this curve. Now from here, the next thing that we get to see is that if you look into this area, then this green area is the area which is the non-default area. So this is the non-default area. Now over here, what we have is, now say this is increased to 30. So I'll say that the probability of the borrower to default is, or the borrower will default if WAT is less than 30. That means what? So over here it was 20. Now what I'm trying to estimate is probability of x less than 30. So this is 30. So over here you see that over here you can see that the probability of this borrower, therefore now the probability of default is much higher. Now it's much higher, right? So over here, so what we can see is that as C increases, as C rises, right, the probability of default increases. Now this is the mathematical part of the story. Now to this story, there is also a intuitive or a logical side. Now obviously the logical side kind of the logical side tallies with this mathematical conclusion that we have made. We will be able to say that yes, this is correct. So let's go back to the side. So what are the factors which drive this value Ci? So the first value is Di, or which is the loan amount, right? Or the debt amount. So over here, what you see is that in this case, the debt amount is something which is like, so over here, what is DI then? So DI is the debt amount, debt obligation. So now assume that everything else remains unchanged. Only the debt increases. So now, say suppose if I look into this example, let's say debt was 100 and this part together was 60. So by 2 that was 20. Now what happens is that debt obligation increases, or the amount of loan that is given, everything else remaining unchanged also increases. So therefore what I get to see is that this CI, so what we get to see is that with an increase in the debt obligation, everything else remaining unchanged, the CI increases, right? Now, the moment CI increases, what I can see is that the area under the cumulative curve will also increase, and hence, mathematically, the probability of default increases. So, that is the reason why we say that a higher amount of loan given out to a borrower, everything else remaining unchanged, is a more risky loan. So, basically, if there are exactly two borrowers with the same kind of asset portfolio, asset structure, and so on, now, what we see is that the moment a higher loan is given out to one of the borrower, that loan becomes more risky. And the reason as to why a loan with a higher volume becomes risky is this particular structure, right? So, from here, we can say that a loan of a higher amount, or a loan given out to a higher amount, is a more risky loan, right? So from here, if we study this particular structure, it will give us some of the most core variables, some of the very core variables which becomes very significant in assessing a PD model. If I'm trying to assess a probability of default model, what should be the overall structure? So this is what we are trying to assess. Clear? So from here, one very simple conclusion that we can draw is a loan of a higher amount, right, is a loan of what should I say? So it's a loan of it's a more risky loan. So a loan of a higher amount is a more risky loan, everything else remaining unchanged. Now comes the next part. The next part that comes out is that what about the asset, right? Now if say everything else remains unchanged, right? Now the initial asset part, the initial asset which is your A0 increases. So there are two farms who are given loans, right? Everything else remains unchanged. So they grow at the same rate. They have similar kind of fluctuations about their average growth rate. So they maintain similar kind of consistency. But there is one farm which started off its business without an initial capital. It started growing up or growing out, and it started on a very low amount of asset. On the other hand, There was another firm which started off with a very large volume of assets. So it already had a very huge amount of money with them, and they from build from other cash flows, and then it started off. Say for example, there is a new startup which comes out, and there is a Google Alphabet which comes out. So obviously, the initial asset that Google Alphabet will come out with would be very large, right? It would be larger compared to any new startup, tech startup, say, for example. So therefore, giving a loan or giving a credit to Google Alphabet is much more convenient to the bank than giving the loan to the new startup, because the initial asset of this borrower is high. Now just observe that everything else remain unchanged, right? If the initial asset rises, the initial asset rises, the probability of the firm to default goes down. And this has been shown in this graph between the green and the black line, right? So there's a black line. So with an increase in the graph, what I can see is there has been an increase, or there has been a spike, right? And there is this particular gap. So what you can see is that from the debt obligation, right, from the debt obligation line, this line, this farm is a more reliable farm than this farm, given everything else remain unchanged. They just start off from a higher intercept. That means to go below the line, go below the red line, this line has to fall much more compared to this green line. That is the reason why. That is the reason why the black line, the firm which follows the black path as far as the asset price is concerned, is a better firm compared to the other. Right? Okay. Now comes the next part. So over here, so one thing that we can actually see from here is, so over here, so one thing that we can see is that a firm with a greater asset size is, or in an obligor with a greater asset size is a less risky borrower, is a less risky firm. And so if I am a firm which had started off with a larger asset size, if my balance sheet assets are larger, then my probability to default is generally lower. And this is the part from where this comes up. Now comes the next part, the impact of duration on this thing, the impact of the duration. Now, the impact of a duration of a loan, right, is quite ambiguous. Right? It depends on the sign that this one would have. Ideally, if the mean growth rate, right, it's sigma square a by 2. Generally, sigma square a by 2 would be a larger value, right? Because sigma a may be less than mu a, but sigma square a can very well be greater than mu a, because you are squaring a value, right, by 2. Now, generally, this difference is generally considered to be negative. It's generally seen that this difference can be negative. So, in that case, if this difference is negative, that is, if mu a minus of sigma square a is less than 0, then everything else remaining unchanged, and increase in the term of the loan, right, would increase the probability of the borrower to default. So, an increase in the term of the loan. So, if you are actually giving out a loan for a higher period of time, that is where your chances of default increases. So, from here, we can actually identify some of the most important factors which affect the probability of default for a particular borrower. One of the major observations over here is that that an increase in the debt obligation or a loan of a higher face value is more risky. The loan given to a borrower with a higher asset is a less risky loan. বলছি বৃষ্টি এসে গেছে এখান থেকে বলবো ডাইনিং টেবিলটা সরিয়ে দিয়ে একটু হ্যাঁ বলি তো অন্য কথা ভাই Okay, so a loan given to a borrower with a higher asset value is less risky. A farm with a higher growth rate in its asset or a better performing farm which performs much better over a period of time or whose asset grows over a period of time given everything else remain unchanged is a better borrower because their chances of default is relatively lower, right? The more consistently a farm behaves over a period of time is a lower borrower is a lower risk loan, or a loan given to a farm which behaves more consistently is relatively less risky than a farm than loan given to a farm which is volatile in nature and everything else remaining unchanged. An increase in the duration of the loan would adversely impact the sorry so an increase in the duration of the loan would cause the loan or would increase the chances of the default for the loan, right? And all this can be identified from this particular expression. So is this part clear to us? Is the intuition behind this equation clear? Great. Preeti, are you clear about this? You were not there yesterday, that's why I'm just asking you once again. Any part that you need me to clarify once again before I move on? Great. Great. Now, one thing that we can clearly see from here is that this Brownian motion component, WAT, which I call the Wiener variable or the white noise process or the Brownian motion process, WAT, which follows a normal distribution with mean zero and a variance t. Now, this WAT is something that I want to assess. What is this exactly all about? And that is where, and that is where, the brown, and this is where the next extension or the next part of the theorization comes up. Now, over here we have been talking about Brownian motion. But what is this Brownian component over here? How do I quantify, how do I see this Brownian component in the real time? Right? Now, Brownian motion, the Wiener process is a theoretical concept, right? But how do I see it in real time or in real business? And that is where this Vasicek specification comes in. I mean, it's not the Vasicek specification per se, right? But this specification was actually used by Vasicek in developing his ASRF model. The specification comes from the Glashow-Morton model itself. So this has been just adapted in the Vasicek framework. Now let's see what this is all about. Now to get an idea about this wind-up process, the first thing that we need to do is we need to describe the portfolio. Right now, till now we have just been talking about the asset path of a borrower, the asset path that the borrower will have, and the debt obligation. Now we need to understand this at a portfolio level. So till now, I was talking about at a transaction level or an account level, or you can say I was just talking about an IF obligor at an obligor level. Now what we are trying to do is we are trying to take it back to the portfolio level. And from there, we'll state the condition or try to identify the condition that actually enables us to develop a model at an account level and then aggregate it at a portfolio level. What is that condition which enables this aggregation for us? So this is what we are going to study in this particular discussion. Right. So now over here, let's see. So the next topic that we come to is describing the portfolio, or it's as it is called the portfolio description. Now, how would I define a portfolio? What is a portfolio? A portfolio is nothing but it's a collection of loans. Is a collection of loans. And what is a portfolio actually comprised of? A portfolio has two aspects. One is obligors and the other is balances. So a collection of loans contains a number of obligors and the exposure from the obligors. The exposure on the loans. So these are the two characteristics that we have over here. Now, as we go ahead with this part, now we assume that each of the borrowers, right? So there are in number of obligors. So this is what our assumption is, and we say that and we assume that for simplicity that the exposure on the loan is equal. So what they have done is they have taken more or less equal volumes of loan, right? Now the loan that they have taken is equal in dollar terms. So in terms of dollars, it is it is this exposure on loans which is there. So over here, when we talk about the number of obligors and the exposure on loans, right? So what it says is, so number one is that the portfolio that I have contains n number of borrowers, and the exposure on the loans is equal in terms of dollars. Now, apart from that, the next part that we talk about is the exposure. So after exposure on loan number of accounts is the maturity of the loan. The loans mature at a given period of time. So the maturity of the loans are the same, which is T. The maturity of the loan terminates at T. So all these loans have been given for T years and they terminate at the period T, right? Now when they terminate at the period T, the next part that we talk about over here is, so what is the probability of default? So we say that each of the loans have a certain probability of default, which is I, where I is running from 1 to n. So if there are some n number of borrowers, if there are 1000 borrowers, then I runs from 1 to 1000. Right? So there are a number of obligors, which is small n, exposure on loans equal. Now these loans exposures are equal in dollar terms. The maturity of the loan is Th time period, and each of the loans terminate at time period T. Okay? So up to this point, is it clear? The portfolio specifications. Okay. So PD is the probability of default. So what I'm saying is the probability of default, right, of the first borrower is P1. Now P1 is a fractional one because it's a probability, right? So it's the chances of default. So how likely is a borrower want I to default? So that is what is PI. Therefore, the PD over here is nothing but the probability of the ith borrower to default. So it's just a number, right? And our objective over here would be to finally calculate this expression or a formula for this PI. And it is this part where we will distinguish between the point in time PD and the through the cycle PD, right? So this model is not only important for for understanding the Basel framework, but it also provides a very critical part or a critical link between two PD rating philosophies, which are really very important, which is point in time and through the cycle. Right? So these are the two important things that we have over here. Okay, so this is what the idea is. So now when we are trying to develop this part over here, so is this PI clear to you now, Vishal? Great. Now the next part that we'll talk about over here is the following. That when we so now the next important thing that I'm going to discuss is or define over here is the loss. So how would you define the loss? And when I talk about loss, I'm talking about the gross loss. So I'm not bringing in the concept of recoveries over here, right? So what I'm talking about is loss. So if there has been a loss on the account, so this is a loss given default, a borrower is defaulted and he has not given the money back. Therefore, it is a loss given default. So what I'm talking about over here is the gross loss. This is the gross loss. So how will I define the gross loss over here? What I'll say is that there is a variable Li. Li is the loss earned by a given borrower. So Li is equal to 1, right? If the borrower has defaulted. So if the borrower is defaulted, then a loss has been occurred. If a borrower has not defaulted, then the loss is not occurred. So Li is equal to 1 if the borrower has defaulted, is equal to 0 otherwise. So the idea over here is that if a loss has been occurred, then it is Li equal to 1. If a loss has not been occurred, the Li is equal to 0. So this is precisely what the idea behind the gross loss is. Plain and simple. So over here, if you see that if I want to calculate the portfolio loss, how will I calculate that? So what I'll do is, Li is one by n, which is the average summation Li. So what I'll do is, so if I need to represent this, this is represented as L1, L2 plus by capital. So there are n number of losses, right? So it's L1 plus L2 plus Ln divided by n. So this is the gross, or this is the portfolio loss, or the average portfolio losses. So this is what your average portfolio loss is, right? So over here we have defined two stuffs. One is the portfolio, the other is the loss, right? Now you see that how these three components are coming in together. So we started off with the asset part, right? Then we talked about the the debt obligations. Now, having discussed these two parts, the next part that I have over here is, that, so I have the asset part, I have the debt obligation, right? From there, the next part that I have is the gross. So the next part I've defined the portfolio for each of the I obligors. So now let's think that there is an ith obligor who has an asset part and who has a debt obligation. And all of them have the same similar debt obligation. What differs is their asset part, right? And all their loans are maturing at the end of Tth time period. Therefore, when this gross loss, so basically some of these borrowers will default on their loans and the amount will go into loss, and some will not be defaulting. So over here, what we are doing is we are just simplifying the portfolio, take into account the fact that a loss is equivalent, a default is equivalent to a loss. So the moment the borrower defaults, the entire amount goes into loss, right? And I'm not going into the recovery and all to make it complicated. So what I'm trying to understand over here is that I have given a loan to a borrower who has a particular asset path, an asset evolution path, an asset path dynamics. Now, if his asset goes below the, if his asset price, if his asset part goes below the debt obligation that he has, he is a defaulter. The moment he defaults, that amount goes into loss. It's as simple as that. Now, out of the portfolio, out of all the obligors, this is a possibility for all, and the chance that the asset part dynamic goes below the debt obligation is Pi for a given borrower, and this Pi is estimated or can be captured by identifying the Brownian motion component, right? So over here, what we need to do is, so therefore, now I am talking about the loss, right? And the loss values will have a relative frequency, and this is where the question of the loss distribution comes in. Because from this part, what I need to understand is that what exactly is the loss distribution for the given bank's portfolio, right? So you see that we started from an obligor, we brought in the portfolio, and now we are computing the loss at the portfolio, and based on that portfolio loss, we are trying to identify the loss distribution of the bank. Now, if you remember the point from where we started off talking about the Basel framework, it was the point, and we started from the point of the expected loss. We had started about the loss distribution. We had talked about the expected loss. We had talked about the unexpected loss, right? And now what we are doing is we are going towards deriving that expected loss distribution, right? So this is how we and so this is what the framework is behind getting that loss, the shape of that loss distribution. Are you getting my point, guys? So are you getting that link as to how we are proceeding? Is this link clear in your minds? Preeti, are you clear? Great. Oh, now comes the next part. Now we have to define. So basically, our next objective over here is to go ahead with the loss distribution. How would the loss distribution look like? How does it look like? Right. Now over here, because of this loss distribution, so we need to, before we go into this loss distribution, we need to formalize, because one thing we can see is that loss arises from PD. So once the borrower defaults, the loss arises, right? And from there we'll get the loss distribution. Therefore, what we need to answer is a more basic part, is PD. So how would the PD, or the probability of default, look like? So over here, while I talk about the probability of default, right? So to talk about the probability of default, we need to define this Wiener variable over here. So we have seen that this Wiener variable has a very important role to play in deciding this P. But what is this Wiener variable? How do I define the Wiener variable in the banking system? Right now, if I go to the banker and I tell him that when I want to know the what is your Wiener variable coefficient or value of your Wiener variable in this particular run, then he would just kick me out of his bank perhaps, right? So I need to understand what is this Wiener variable. Now the Wiener variable, as we had discussed yesterday, is comprised of two parts. It's comprised of industry specific risk and it is comprised of company specific risks, right? So over here, what I can write over here is, this is y root rho, and this is zi, over here we say that the Wiener variable, or this Brownian motion, or the variable which creates the Brownian motion or the stochasticity or the uncertainty in the entire system, is comprised of factors. So what are the factors? The factors are, number one, y root rho. So this is portfolio common factor. So this is the common factor, or the single factor to which all the portfolios are exposed. So this is the portfolio common factor. This is the portfolio common factor. So this is that factor, or that set of factor on which, based on to which all the farms are exposed. Say for example, this typical factor is, so if you think about the 2008 financial crisis, you will get to see that because the housing prices, or the movements in the housing prices, which was a portfolio common factor. Now once the housing prices crashed, all the farms or all the companies which were involved into real estate business had fallen down. So that was, so even the company itself was financially sound, but it was exposed to that portfolio risk, right? The common portfolio factor. So basically, this is a single factor to which the banks are exposed. Now the other part is the company specific factors. So this part is your company. This is your company specific, and these are absolutely specific to each firm, and it is not a common factor, right? So these are factors which arise within each company. So therefore, this is also known as the company specific risk, whereas this portfolio common factor is also known as the single risk factor. Now from here, right, so now these have their respect, and the rho and 1 minus rho is the correlation between it. So root rho shows the extent of correlation, right? What exactly? So over here we see that the farms, the loss distribution that the farms earn is not absolutely independent of each other. So zeta is totally independent, right? But root rho is a correlation between the, it is the correlation between the risk. So basically, it is the exposure. So what is the correlation on the, or the correlation between the funds on with the portfolio factor, right? So how associated am I as a firm with the fluctuations in the portfolios? So if there is a huge portfolio risk, if there is a sudden factor which impacts my portfolio, then to what extent would I be impacted by it? So root rho shows the correlation. This rho is the correlation coefficient. It shows the degree of association of the firm with the portfolio factor. So this is known as the correlation coefficient. This is the correlation coefficient. right? So is this Wiener process or the construction of the Wiener process clear to us? The Wiener process comprises of two factors. One is a portfolio common factor, and the other is the company specific factor. And rho shows the correlation of a firm with each of these respective factors. So rho is a correlation of a firm, or a rho correlation of an obligor with the portfolio common factor, and 1 minus rho is the correlation of the obligor with the company specific factor. Now, for a very high value of rho, it shows that a firm is particularly is very highly associated with the portfolio common factor, whereas whereas it is less affected to the company specific risks. So the choice of this rho will decide whether a particular borrower has a high association with the portfolio factor or a low association with the portfolio factors, right? So is the construction of this part clear? Are we clear on this? Any questions? Aditya, Preeti, Vishal. Okay, I'm coming to that ZI. So each of the ZIs, the ZI that you can see over here, right? It's a standard normal variable. So basically ZI, so each of these ZIs over here, they follow a normal distribution. They follow a normal distribution with mean 0 and variance 1, right? And Z1, Z2, Zn are mutually exclusive. So they are not related to each other, right? So over here, when I talk about this Zi, right? So the Zi is a mutually exclusive. So it's a variable which follows a normal distribution with mean 0 and a variance 1. So this is what. So basically, at a very intuitive level, what we need to understand is that there are two components, right? So one of the components of the Wiener process. One is the portfolio specific risk, and the next is the company specific risk. So now, till now, we were talking about the riskiness at an obligor level. But now, the next thing that we need to do over here is we need to go back and we need to explain this risk at a portfolio level. And if we are able to do this aggregation from the obligor to the portfolio level, then we'll be able to identify that factor which enables us to do this, or what are those conditions that must be there which would enable us to to help us summarize the portfolio risk, right? So the obligor level risk at a portfolio. So basically, I develop a credit card model, right, at an obligor level. Now, when I'm implementing that at a portfolio level, right? So for one particular market, I'm just implementing that. Now I get all my expected losses and everything over there, and then I keep on adding up across the portfolios. And then I go to a portfolio level RW, and from then at a bank level RW. So there are multiple level of aggregation that I can do, right? But how can you say that so if I am say I am a bank which operates in India, right? So I develop the RWA for say for the Indian region, for India, right? And then I'm a bank which also operates in Pakistan. I develop the RWA for Pakistan, and then I add the two RWA. Now, if I'm adding the two RWA, I can only do the addition if these two RWA are homogeneous in all nature. So what ensures that I can do this kind of an aggregation to reach the bank level RWA? What ensures that I can add up RWA at different levels? So this, or how can I add up the ELs at different levels? How can I from an obligor level PD, how can I create a segment level PD by adding the PD of all the obligors? So how can I do these aggregations? Right. So the Vasicek asymptotic single risk frontier model will tell us that under what conditions can this aggregation be done, and why is it that this aggregation can be done at our level. Right. So basically, how do I aggregate this at a portfolio level? That is what is most important. So one thing is I can look into the probability of default, right, at an obligor level. But if I want to do it at a portfolio level, I need to take into account all the n number of obligors who are there. So what I need to do is I need to take the loans at. So now what I need to know is the portfolio loss distribution. The portfolio loss distribution, right? So over here, when I talk about the portfolio loss, so I need to find out how. So what is the portfolio loss, or how do I define the portfolio loss? So I'll say that portfolio loss can be defined as the number of defaults that happen at the portfolio. So what I need to calculate is what is the probability that some k number of loans that some k number of loans will default out of it. So what I need to know over here is that what is the probability that some k number of loans will default out of the n number of loans that we have. Okay. So probability that some k number of loans will default out of n, right? Now, how do I? So this is So the next thing that we need to understand is the joint probability of default. So what is the probability that borrower A and borrower B and borrower C and borrower D would default? So that is what is joint probability of default. This is what we call the joint probability. So my next we'll take this part up, right? So I just take a pause. I'll take a pause for 2 minutes, go through these topics that we have discussed right now, and then we'll start back again. I'll just take a 2 minutes break in between. Thank you.